This is the Cinematologist Podcast. On today's episode, we discuss Akira Kurosawa. Dario interviews the curators of a brand new, extensive BFI retrospective on the Japanese filmmaker's work, the filmmaker Asif Kapadia and the writer Ian Hayden Smith. Elsewhere in the episode, Neil and Dario talk about the continuing influence of Kurosawa and in particular focus on some of his post-war Japanese contemporary work, including deep dives into I Live in Fear and High and Low. On with the show. Welcome to the Cinematologist Podcast. I'm Neil Fox, and joining me, as always, I'm delighted to say, is Dario Linares. Hello, Dario.
I'm very good, Neil. How are you?
I'm okay, yeah. I'm in a friend's attic room in between houses currently, and I'm pleased to be talking to you today back on the podcast, getting back into the rhythm of recording every couple of weeks. It's nice to be back in the rhythm of it. So how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. Just getting into the beginning of term. I'm actually doing some teaching this term rather than just sort of, admin, paper shuffling, management, that kind of stuff, which is all very important apparently. What's interesting though is I've been watching quite a lot of films as well, and I suppose it ties a little bit into the episode that we've got today, which is on a classic filmmaker, of course, Akira Kurosawa. Watched Vertigo with our Monday night film club group last night, which was interesting because there probably 3 or 4 of them had seen it and the rest hadn't, and it was really interesting to rewatch that again. And I did find it quite slow. I hate that as a derogatory term, saying something is just slow, but I'm really not a fan of Vertigo in over and above, say, Rear Window and Psycho. I'd rather watch those 2 movies above Vertigo, any day of the week. It was interesting talking about that idea of suspension of disbelief, and I find it now very difficult to watch a film like Vertigo, and probably Hitchcock generally, and maybe even 50s filmmaking from Hollywood more broadly, as anything other than a film studies academic exercise, because I can never get into the sense of this is a real scenario. And maybe people who've written a lot about Vertigo talk about it, the psychology of it, and it's you kind of experiment in that, and it's not a realist film, because I was lecturing on sort of realism versus classicism versus formalism on Monday, and it was an interesting film them to screen in relationship to that. But then it's also fed into a lot of the films that I've seen over the last week or so because I've gotten into a lot of watching again, which probably I'll talk about the film specifically on the bonus, seeing as on the bonus last week we didn't really talk about films at all.
No, we talked about other stuff. This time, yes, promised there'll be some film chat on the film podcast bonus. But as a lot of that watching at the cinema, which again will tie into one of the things that might come out of today's interview in terms of like, how are you seeing this stuff? You seem to be going to the cinema a lot as well as sort of just watching more films.
Yeah, I mean, I talk a little bit about that in the upcoming newsletter that I was very lucky to be put on the Sight and Sound press screening list. So I got to see EO, the Simoleski film. Is that his surname? Am I pronouncing that correctly? At the
Skolomovsky, I
cinema.
think it's.
Yeah. Apologies, I didn't have it in front of me. So I saw that there. Then I've got my Picture Houses Central membership, so it's always easy now. I've still got about 5 free films to go and see. I'm paid up still to Mubi Go, so you get a free film every week for that. I do want to go and see Holy Spider this week, but I also watched All Quiet on the Western Front at home. So it's a mixture of stuff now. We went to see Tar at the weekend. So yeah, I mean, I am seeing stuff at on the big screen, let's say, again, because we watched Vertigo the other night in the university, so it was just in a university seminar room. But yeah, I do find I do still try to go as much as I can to the cinema, because I just do find it. I mean, I've kind of come around full circle. I mean, remember when I was down at Falmouth and I was doing a lot of work on sort of new forms of interaction and digital screening at the burgeoning sense of the streaming era back in sort of 2012 onwards, and the relationship to social media and that kind of stuff was a big topic back then, before it came kind of more mainstream now. But I've kind of come full circle on that, where I actually do feel that there is something unique, particularly from a concentration perspective, that you switch everything off and you watch the film with the big screen and also with an audience. So there is a kind of unspoken aura or atmosphere in a given room, I think, that comes from the apparatus of the cinematic auditorium.
Yes, I feel like a pauper watching Kurosawa films on my iPad ahead of today's episode, but that's them's the rubs. And I did watch one on the big telly, the film that I'll talk about at more length later on when we get into the episode. So, do you want to set up the episode for us, because this is an interview that you conducted?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, it was just an invite again from contacts now at the BFI, who asked if we wanted to do an episode on Kurosawa. They have a retrospective season, which I think essentially is every film, and it has been curated by the filmmaker Asif Kapadia and the writer Ian Hayden Smith. And yeah, it was just great to be offered the chance to speak to them. I spoke to them in the afternoon before they were doing their launch event. So they were going to do a 2-hander on stage at the BFI, and then I forget which film that they were screening at that particular moment, but there was a film on afterwards. I think they say it in the interview, but I can't remember. And it's an interesting duo, because we talked a little bit about how they got to know each other, I think through Sheffield Docfest, and there was a sense that there was the writer and the filmmaker kind of coming together to collaborate, and coming from sort of different angles in terms of their love and admiration of Kurosawa. So, and I think that difference, that complementarity, comes across in the interview quite a lot that you're going to hear now. And yeah, I've managed to see quite a few of the films. Seven Samurai at the BFI at NFT1, which was just amazing, just amazing. I mean, I think I said to you, didn't I? Maybe I said it on one of the last podcasts that it would have been on my top 10 all-time films if I'd have seen it at the cinema just before the list came out, as it were. So yeah, it was just a great opportunity to go back to Kurosawa. I mean, again, it's probably the second filmmaker that we've gone back to again, and I don't want to make a habit of that, but I think that the opportunity to discuss maybe in the interview, we discussed some of the big, marquee films, let's say, of the masterpieces of Kurosawa's oeuvre. But you and I think we're going to talk about some of the slight, not obscure, but some of the films that perhaps don't get the same attention as the big named films.
Yeah, I think you're right in terms of this is the second time we've gone back. We did it with Hannah Strong and her book on Sofia Coppola, and I think both times they've been good opportunities where it's like, oh, actually, yeah, for the Coppola it was, how has her career and perception of her career shifted in in the last couple of films since we did sort of Lost in Translation a few years ago, and then certainly for this one, it was, as your conversation covers very accurately, there's a lot of films. It's a big career. The idea that when we did Yojimbo, that was all we had to say about Kurosawa was obviously we never thought that would be the case. And what I really enjoy about one of the things I enjoy about the conversation you have is how they talk about it as an act of curation, and how to consider phases, themes in a filmmaker's body of work that's that vast. And I certainly took it as an opportunity, as I know you did, to kind of root around in some of the other. And I think I just took the approach of I was going to watch those films set in contemporary Japan, rather than historical Japan, and see what emerged from just spending time with a few of those films. So it's been a really great opportunity that we've had, from the BFI to spend time with this filmmaker, and it was a nice opportunity to do a different approach rather than just one film or like you say, the same films. Be able to just spend a bit of time with other titles.
Yeah, and also listening to various film podcasts. Sometimes I'm a little bit jealous of when they go for when they have the time, let's say, for more deep dives. And I've always enjoyed episodes where we've gone for one film and just gone to town on it, for an hour or so or something like that. And yeah, I mean, it's just great. It's great that we get the opportunities to have the interviews that we do and do the subjects that we do. But then occasionally I'm just like, it would be great to just sort of really talk about this film without sort of any dressing around it. But I think this was such a good opportunity for this conversation. It really, both of the guys, I think, got into the spirit of the kinds of questions that a cinematologist kind of interview, let's say, and it was, and they were very happy. It was great for them to have a kind of warm up act for their, on stage, which they were doing sort of half an hour afterwards. So that was nice. But before we get to the interview, I just very quickly want to mention a couple of people who've been sharing the podcast. So thanks very much to Beth Morris for recommending the podcast on Twitter. Who, I mean, that was in reaction to the Ennis Main episode. So thank you very much for saying how much you enjoyed that. And then Mark Hancock, not Matt Hancock, I hasten to add, Mark Hancock, who continually tweets about the podcast. So thanks, Mark, for your continued support, and is a Patreon subscriber. If you want to join us on Patreon for our little after party soiree, where we will be talking about films this time, and also getting the bonus newsletter, which is extensive and even more extensive than usual because Neil's back in charge of it this month. And thanks very much. Yeah, we've got a new Patreon subscriber who is enigmatically called MS. So I don't know what that stands for, but thank you very much for joining and becoming a Patreon subscriber. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thanks for all of your continued support across various social media platforms and the Patreon. I am back on newsletter duty, my first time, and I think you'll find it. I think people find it different. I've gone for a different approach, certainly to my recommendations. So hopefully, it won't feel as overwhelming as it might have done in the past with me just throwing 4,000 things at you. I'm trying to be a bit more considerate with that. Hopefully you will still enjoy it if you are a Patreon, and it might entice you to sign up if you're not. But for now, let's move into the main part of the episode where Dario and I will be talking about Kurosawa and some of his films, particularly around sort of contemporary post-war Japan. But before that, here is Dario with the curators of the BFI season, Asif Kapadia and Ian Hayden Smith.
はまたすでに夢の中にいるような気がする。夢は右翼の現れというからな。わしは天下を盗むためには。 は人間は軽薄なもんですな。生命がどんなに美しいもんかってことをもう死に直面したという初めて知る。血の匂いを嗅いで腹の減った野良犬が集まってきやがる。世の中には悪人はいない。悪い環境があるだけだ。
狂った今の世で日が来るなら際立ちかだ。
So, I'm at the BFI Southbank with filmmaker Asif Kapadia and writer Ian Hayden Smith, who have curated an extensive, indeed complete, season on the master Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa. Gentlemen, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
So, I was thinking about my first encounter with Kurosawa's work, and I think this was studying film at university, and one of my lecturers back in the VHS days kind of showed us 2 or 3 clips, swapping the tapes in and out and what have you. And he showed us scenes from Hidden Fortress and Yojimbo and then compared them to Star Wars. And I think it was a way in of saying to the students, the films that you love and are at the center of kind of late 20th century popular culture are rooted in form and theme back to this post-war Japanese filmmaker. So I thought maybe you guys could start by talking a little bit about how you got into Kurosawa.
So I've been thinking about this because of the season. I mean, the reason why I kind of wanted to do this, I was asked by Jason Wood at the BFI, and I'm a filmmaker and I'm a film fan, and I've always been interested in Japanese culture and Japanese cinema. So, the kind of holy trinity in a way of Kurosawa, who kind of, in my experience, was the kind of samurai filmmaker, the action filmmaker, and Ozu, who did a kind of smaller, quieter films, maybe family films. And then I remember when I was at film school, someone mentioning Mizoguchi, who I'd not really heard of, and then seeing Ugetsu and being blown away. So I'm always interested in world cinema. I love the kind of idea of I get taken away on a journey. So for Kurosawa, my first experience was, probably the Seven Samurai, and seeing that and kind of remember thinking, God, this is long. But what I've been thinking about is I think I experienced Kurosawa subconsciously by the filmmakers that he influenced. I saw the films by them, saw those films, loved those films, and then only later on realised, oh no, they were ripping him off. He'd done it all before. So, my first experience of Kurosawa is probably watching a Sergio Leone film and thinking, this is great, I love what they're doing here, and then not really understanding where it came from. And it's only later on I saw Kurosawa's films on a big screen, but the honest truth is I probably had only seen a few of them over the years on the big screen. And I think that's what's exciting about this, is you get a chance to see them all properly the way they were intended.
Yeah, absolutely. Ian?
One of the elements was the Christmas issue of the Radio Times. As a kid, I realized really early that I was attracted to watching films, and I couldn't work out why. But rather than anything else, rather than cartoons or programs on TV, there was something about a movie that really got me. And we only ever had the Radio Times at Christmas, the bumper double issue. And unlike now where you can access films anytime, this was more often than not the only time you could see a whole glut of films over one period. Films were showing all the time in the day and in the evenings. And every day you would have one large image, and it was like the big film that's showing that day. And I remember, I think it was about 84, Diva had this amazing picture, and all these other films. And one of them it wasn't even a film poster or a still. It was some kind of cartoon or something created by someone in the art department of a Kurosawa film. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was Kagemusha. And that was my first inkling, or first time I think probably I'd heard of Japanese cinema, let alone Kurosawa. And then I grew up in Wales, and the nearest art house cinema was in Cardiff, Chapter Art Cinema. And they had a screening of Kagemusha there, and this would be the late 1980s. And that was my first experience. I'll be honest, I didn't like it very much.
Right.
Um,
That's one hard one to get to start with, I think.
It's a tough one. And then came Yojimbo in college.
Yeah.
And I know Asif, that's the film he's going to be introducing in February. And that's kind of almost like the perfect access point for Kurosawa.
Yeah. And I actually think that story that I told about the university, it was the scene from the cantina with the lopping off of the arm and sort of sorting out of the bad guys, So, the tagline for this season is the most visionary Hollywood director that Hollywood has never had, which is, obviously a sort of clever way into it. And, you've mentioned there, you started to mention this influence that is just seems to be all encompassing, all of the kind of big masters of contemporary Hollywood sort of mentioned Kurosawa. But I just wondered, in sort of rewatching the films and putting the season together, what are some of the ways maybe that you guys have articulated and what you're going to talk about in your intro tonight in terms of that, the specifics of that influence?
Well, it was really great because Asif was already on board. And likewise, Jason Wood, who both of us have known for a very long time, approached me and said, would you be interested in working with Asif? And then we met. And we'd previously worked last year at Sheffield Docfest.
Yeah.
And Asif put together this fantastic program of documentaries that had influenced him. And we started chatting about it. And it was Asif who came up with this. Yeah, I remember you saying right out from the start, we are not doing it chronologically.
Right.
And actually, bizarrely, Kurosawa is interesting that even if you did show his work chronologically, unlike most directors, you've actually got a selection of brilliant films throughout the whole of his career. Most directors, you have that one core period. Then either side, it gets a bit
something
dodgy.
Of a bell curve with most
Yeah,
directors,
it's quite amazing with him. You do have this amazing start, bit of a dip, then this incredible middle period, but then the later period, he comes back with amazing films. But that was really great because having that in our minds, we're not doing it chronologically, meant, well, what are we doing? And then you start to look at elements of his work. Some are themes, but some are things that just come around naturally. Professional lives, whether it's a doctor, whether it's a lawyer, whether it's a Ronin or samurai, you've got these characters who live by their profession, and then on from that you get honor. And then you start playing around with it. And so we ended up kind of coming together and sort of agreeing on these six themes.
What was your aversion to just out of a matter of interest, to doing this chronologically? Was it more that you didn't want to kind of be didactic or completist, or the sense that if you see them out of order, you actually are able to pick out the kind of patterns in a more complex way, maybe?
Partly it was like, how do we group them differently to what,
Sure.
There's obviously, you can always just do everything chronologically, but how do you group it to make it interesting and to mix them up? I don't know how many, I know it's the BFI, so maybe there are people who say, I'm going to start at the beginning, and I'm going to go to the end, and I'll be there for it could happen. I don't know if I could do that. I'd love to do that. I wish I had the time to do that. So most of us were going to dip in. When are you actually able to go to see a film? When is that film on? When is that film print available? There are all these things that come into programming, which I'm not from that background, but they are kind of like just how things work and and then it's like, how do you just make it interesting? So they're not like all the black and white ones or, all the ones about blokes with swords. And, I think that was part of it. And Ian did a brilliant job of doing all the hard work of how do we kind of put this down? And we have to start somewhere. I think in the end, the main thing is you should see them on a big screen. Yeah. This is the opportunity to see them the way they're intended on great screens, sound-wise, see the cinematography, see the design. I think they all look amazing. I think that's the thing that I myself forget. I don't know. Maybe that's part of it, okay? I haven't seen them all on a big screen. So I'm still learning along the way. I'm just here because I'm a fan, but I also know there's so many films I haven't seen yet, and I've been saving them up. And that's one of the reasons why the BFI exists for me, is that there is a season coming of a filmmaker who everyone said is one of the greatest filmmakers, but I never got to see them the way they were intended. And I know I can watch them on a BFI Player. I know I can watch them on my iPad, on my phone, or while I'm kind of on a train. But it is nice every now and again to see some of the world's greatest work of cinema on the best screens, and then understand, and then to look at, my God, they're not dated, they're really brilliant. He's really good at talking about things which, even though, there are Japanese elements that you might not always get, or the performances might be big, or there's something else going on, you can see a good director. When you see a good director, you can see why he's the guy that Coppola, Scorsese, Lucas, and all the kind of American movie brats that I grew up with, they said, this is the man. He's the god, you know. And I think that's what I think is important for me to look back at it and see Rashomon, for example. You know, I cannot believe, you know, what is that, 80 years old? What is it? 70, 80 years old?
72 years old.
Mad.
It's so
it doesn't
fresh.
feel dated.
Yeah.
You know, they don't feel dated. They were kind of dated when they were made, but they haven't dated since. They're still really challenging and clever and cinematic, kind of visually, they're just amazing, but also intellectually, they're really, really clever.
Yeah.
I think just quickly, a couple of things you said there. You know, Rashomon, first of all, January is kind of pivoted around Rashomon because it's a re-release. And what's great about it is that some people perhaps talk about Kurosawa's genre cinema. Generally, that's people who are just looking at his period films. But even those, they're not just Shanbara, the sword play period dramas. There's lots of other things going on in there. But Rashomon's really interesting because that wasn't... He created a genre. He created something completely new with Rashomon. Yes, it might be based on two classic short stories by a Japanese writer, but what he put on film is just extraordinary. I love the fact... Asif says, we decided to mix it up. That was the other thing you said. I remember you saying mix. And so the thing about creating these 6 different strands was whatever we do, it can't just be 5 period films in one strand. It has to be something that makes someone think, okay, right, I saw Yojimbo, and that's the professional life of a Ronin. But actually, you know, why don't I now go and see Drunken Angel about a doctor treating a Yakuza, or Stray Dog about a cop who loses his gun? And so our hope was you might go and see the really well-known film, and that will get you thinking about what we're trying to do with that strand, and perhaps leap on to something else. And that's something we really wanted to kind of encourage. And don't you dare ever watch a Kurosawa film on an iPhone.
In terms of those, just to sort of name those strands that you were talking about, the January strands are society, social status, and honor, and then the February ones are professional lives, family, and unclassifiable. I think she'll get out clause. There,
that's the kind of a get all the rest. It is a get and clause, but I think the reason kind of came down to it. Dersu Uzala, first of all, is the only film that he directed that was made outside of Japan, fully made outside Japan, and not in Japanese. Madadeo is the closest he's ever come to a comedy. Dreams is a portmanteau film of 7 films, originally planned to do 8, but 7 together. And the 2 Sanshiro Shugata films, yes, they're period films, and they're about someone who wants to be a judo master, but they don't fit exactly into that area of a professional life or honor, strictly speaking. But the other reason I wanted to do that, and is something that I'll say in any introduction or on stage, is everything could be unclassifiable. None of these fit perfectly into their categories. It's like one big Venn diagram. And they each jump over. So having something unclassifiable hopefully will make people think, actually, I can get from this what I want.
That leads into something that I read in one of your intros, one of the pieces you did leading up to the season. And maybe you can speak to this, Asif, because it's this idea that it's actually a little bit difficult to define Kurosawa through quite a rigid formalist language, because the breadth of his filmmaking is so epic and different, you know. I mean, there are technical motifs like the wipe, and then there's sort of symbolic ones like rain or what have you. But to me, it's the framing and the movement, and, you know, the way that the movement of the camera is in symbiosis with his blocking and his working with the actors and all that kind of thing. And to me, he's a bit like Spielberg in that he just intuitively knows where the camera and you know, where it should go. So
I mean, Spielberg knows because of him.
Because of him, yeah. No, but I was just wondering, like, as a filmmaker yourself, is that something that you can kind of watch and kind of think, yeah, I can see what he's doing there, and take that for my own work, you know?
Absolutely. I think, that's one of the reasons that he is technically amazing. You know, he's so brilliant with how the story is told visually. And as I said, all of the other departments, the way the design works with really, really clever, set piece sequences and using all of the tools of filmmaking, like weather, rain, mud, cuts, music, sound, wipes. It's everything. It's the design, it's the costumes, it's color, when there's color, or if it's black and white, light, dappled light, sunlight, flat light. Really, everything has been designed and planned and drawn out and then shot and executed in a way that kind of remains timeless. And then, just looking kind of at the list of films as we're talking, you're like, what amazing body of work. You see it on a page, it's like, you just sort of look at how many films in every year there's a great movie that came out, and you're just thinking, my God, it seems so hard. As a filmmaker, how hard to make one film. And then you look back an era when you have a group of filmmakers who made a great film every 1 year, 2 years, or sometimes 2 films a year. And I think that kind of it's another life, it's another universe. And I think each one then to stand the test of time in its own way. And so I think the main thing is for them to be seen. I think that's what I'd say. And I look at the list, and I think the themes and the groups and how we put them out, it doesn't matter. Yeah. It's seeing them and seeing some of the films you haven't heard of. And I'm speaking to myself as much as I am to anyone else, seeing the films that you don't know and just trying them out. And I think you mentioned something, Ian, which is like, as you get older, as I get older, you see a film and you go, it didn't really work for me. And then you see it again, you go, oh, now I kind of get it. Yeah. And then you might see it again and go, God, it felt really slow. And I think that's just interesting with like great cinema, is you can watch them again and again at different times and you feel different things because you're different. Your situation and your experience changes.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I was going to say with that, a really great example is, in many ways, the two main actors, Takashi Shimura and Toshiro Mifune, in Kurosawa's films, to see them together as a kid, well, in my late teens, in Seven Samurai, and I just got the wildness of Mifune. And I wasn't old enough to understand Shimura. Yeah. And now I watch that film and I can see the wisdom of Shimura and the sense of patience and the planning and understanding the long game rather than responding in the moment. And I mean, that's the wonderful thing, like you said, about watching these films at different stages in your life. You respond so differently to them.
Yeah. And it seems, just sort of reading a little bit of the background of, again, refreshing myself with the background of Kurosawa's context, his early life and then his introduction into the film industry in Japan. It's interesting because he is a product of a system, but he's a true artist, I think, in the sense that he's curious and influenced by so many other things outside of film. I mean, you could talk about the fact that he was influenced by Hollywood himself and then gave back. So, he's a big fan of John Ford and what have you. But, Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, martial arts, painting, politics and Marxism, all of these things are actually woven through a lot of the time in many of his films,
I think there's something really essential that I know this is, through experience, it's a thing that Asif has talked about passionately. Before he became a filmmaker, he was a screenwriter. Solidly a screenwriter for 2 years, but obviously for the first 20 years of his career as a director, he needed money, so he carried on writing scripts for other people. But before he became even a screenwriter, he was an apprentice director. Yep. From third assistant director to second to first to chief. And that's something you've talked about, Asif, about this difference between the West and East in terms of filmmaking.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the UK we have a very American tradition of, films are controlled by the production. Producers are the big power. They hire a director. And then when you're shooting, you have an assistant director. And the assistant director is really a production person. Their role is to make sure you run on time and to be the person in between the director, the creative, and the production, the producers, the money. And so they're the ones that like time, keeping track of time. How many shots have you got? When did we turn over? Literally, what time did we start shooting, end shooting? How many pages did we get? What did we miss? And this is my experience, okay? So that's very much that's the Western kind of tradition. That's the American system that we in the UK have. Yeah. I've worked in India and I've worked in France as well. And a lot of countries, particularly in India, and I think it seems like in Japan, the leader is the director. The director runs the show. They are in control. And the way you learn is by assisting a director. You work your way up by being an assistant in a department. And it's very different. Because if I wanted to get into filmmaking, I can't assist a film director.
No.
Right? I might be able to watch them work, but there's no role. So it's very hard to learn. You have to go off and make your own films. And what was really interesting working in India, which is very similar, I think, to the kind of more Asian tradition, is that the director is the boss on top. They have different departments, and people in the departments report back to them.
Yeah.
And every department reports back to them in a very different way, not necessarily the production. And so he learned the trade by watching other directors, by assisting them. And that may then become, I need you to go and find a location. It may be, I need you to go and cast someone. It may be, it's more creative rather than make sure they're on time.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that is how you learn. And then that's how you work your way up, and you have a master who you're learning from. And then you become the master and you teach the next generation, which is a much better system.
No, absolutely. I was reading about this sort of mentorship with Kojiro Yamamoto, and the wide range of roles he actually performed as an assistant director. And it seems like it must logically give you a more holistic sense of the entire filmmaking process,
I think it's brilliant, but what it is it all comes down to, who's in charge, the art or the money. And I think that's what's sort of interesting. And my experience of it is that you can't break a system, which is very the Hollywood tradition, is that you become successful as a director enough to be the producer, to be in charge. Whereas in India, everyone will say, how can I assist you? How can I work for you in order to do that? And you go, right, I want you to go and find me a location. You've been on this film all the way through. You know what I like. You know what I don't like. Go and find them. So when I worked in India on The Warrior, which was me being inspired by Leone, inspired by Kurosawa on my first film, I wanted it to kind of feel like one of those films, but also I worked within an Indian system, which meant I had an associate director who was a young director who wanted to work with me, who was there for the casting, who was there for the shoot, who was there for the location finding. We did it all. And then we told the kind of heads of department, this is what we want. And then we let them run it. And I found it was a great system of working. And if something goes wrong, which invariably they do, somebody else understands the director's vision. I know it's changing, the tradition, but I found that way of working great. And it's very similar in France as well. The assistant director has a different role. And I think it is very much the UK is much more influenced, it seems, by the kind of US studios.
It's that level of trust and nurturing. Like Yamamoto's last film with Kurosawa's last film with Yamamoto is 1941's Horse. And Yamamoto was already working on another film and pretty much said, you take over. Yeah. But that idea of trust, it does happen. I remember a story about Spielberg was preparing Schindler's List, or had already started working on Schindler's List, but was working on Jurassic at the same time. And he turned to Richard Attenborough and said, look, can you kind of take over Jurassic for a couple of weeks and I'll go off? And Attenborough said, no, you can't do that. You have to wait. But that level of trust. And likewise, Charlotte Wells with After Sun, which I think is a wonderful film. She was on a course at Sundance, and she had as her mentor Barry Jenkins.
Right.
And it would have been really easy to rush her. But Barry Jenkins, I saw one interview with him where he said, you could see the process happening, and this was not going to happen quickly. So it's just finding that moment of saying, okay, we'll give you that time, and having to get to a point where you do have to make the film. But she was given so much time that you end up with the film she made, which is extraordinary.
Yeah, it is a great film, for sure. Just on the Western context of Kurosawa, there's been a shitload written about that, and it's interesting that his first film, Sanshiro Sugata, was considered too Western for Japanese censors at the time, and it was only Ozu that intervened apparently and got it released. But interestingly, this is a critique that's followed Kurosawa throughout his career. He's too Western, and maybe that essentially collates to too populist in comparison to, as you said earlier on, Asif, Ozu and Mizoguchi. So, to me, though, it's kind of like he defies that highbrow, lowbrow, that sense of genre versus auteur. cinema. So I don't know. I wondered what you think of that critique and why it's it's a little bit disingenuous. I think.
I think that sometimes being first doesn't work in your favor in the long run. And obviously, a lot has been written about, and at the time, Rashomon was the thing that opened the floodgates because it won at Venice first of all, then it won an honorary Oscar, and it was followed by Ozu and then Mizoguchi, and you then have the filmmakers, or the critics who became filmmakers at Cahiers du Cinema, the pre French New Wave, particularly Jacques Rivette, along with the editor of that journal, André Bazin, saying, well, actually, Mizoguchi is Japanese. And I think part of it comes from... Paul Schrader has a bit of this as well. I think part of it comes from this very romantic view of Japan. And saying, well, if we're going to talk about Japanese cinema, we're going to talk about the highbrow modernist Japanese cinema of the kind of minimal approach of Ozu or what Mizoguchi does. Mizoguchi tells the tale of the 40 Ronin. It's 3.5 hours long and has all the action happening off camera. So we just have discussions. And I think it's unfair because I think with that, people are not looking at the sheer range of what Kurosawa accomplished. They're just looking at the small aspects of his work. And I think when you do look at the whole body of work, the good films and some of the films not so good, there are always elements in there that you think he's really doing something quite amazing. And he's not doing Hollywood. He was breaking the 180-degree rule. He would have jump cuts, except they were axial cuts. You were cutting going towards something. But it was done in a way that Hollywood would never allow that.
Yeah. And he was doing it intensified continuity before that was even a thing, I don't know, Asif, have you got any sort of comment on that with the sort of Japanese connection? I mean, particularly, post-war Japanese kind of revivalism, let's say, or reconstruction, let's say, is an interesting era of history anyway. And he's the director who's sort of placed within that period, isn't he?
I think it's a tricky one because who am I? How do we in London, sitting here at the Southbank, decide what is or isn't Japanese cinema? I'm not qualified to say that. I'm kind of more of the, we've just had the kind of Sight and Sound, Wells, the greatest films in history kind of come out, and we're talking about films or a filmmaker that's kind of considered in the canon. And, I think the idea of we decide what is or isn't Japanese cinema from the West is mad. What I could say in every film that I've seen, there's always something going on that I'm like, well, that's a bit unusual. That's a bit weird. The level of performance is huge sometimes. And you go, right, is that a Japanese thing? Is that because of theatre or kabuki? Or, going back to Rashomon, the thing that I'd forgotten, everyone talks about, it's a film made up of lots of point of views. The thing that I'd forgotten myself was, and one of the point of views is a bloke who's dead. And that's just like not even really commented on. One of them comes back from the beyond to give evidence in court. And I'm like, that's fucking Japanese. Pardon my French. That's quite Japanese. It's like that idea of just like seamlessly going into sort of something which is from another life or from beyond is not Western. That's not Hollywood. And that happens in a lot of the films like magical realism or something that goes on that you're just like, that's unusual. Yeah. And I think that it's all in there. It's just that the techniques of filmmaking, like you said, he may have got them from John Ford or he may have seen them somewhere else. Then people take them back and steal them and recreate them. But I think...
But then you're saying that about this character from the dead in Rashomon. And if you look at the majority of Hollywood films, when you have that kind of Deus Ex Machina event happening in a film, it's seen as some kind of moral commentary on what's happening.
For sure.
But the guy beyond the grave is still lying.
Yeah.
That's what's extraordinary. That says a lot about Kurosawa's worldview, is that even though sometimes someone might come out on top or we have a benevolent act, at the end, let's take Ikiru. Yeah, it's a wonderful thing that this man does, but don't forget, we're not left solely with that. We're left with a bunch of bureaucrats trying to take credit for what this person did. He doesn't have the best view of humanity.
No, but he also acknowledges that that notion of humanity acting, say, inauthentically or in their own interest is often a product of the situation that they find themselves in as well, which is kind of interesting and very different to the psychologically driven American cinema, which is that this person is inherently evil or whatever. It's interesting and really complex stuff a lot of the time. And we talked a bit there about, you know, the big hitters, is it well, the marquee films, you know, Akira, Seven Samurai, Rashomon. These are the ones that are talked about as part of canonical lists. But we've all said that we're big fans of the quote-unquote lesser-known works. I mean, I've just watched I Live in Fear for the first time, and I'm going to talk about that when I talk to Neil, my co-host, in part of the podcast. So I just wondered, what are the under-the-radar titles that you would kind of recommend and think, yeah, you've got to see that?
His first film, Sanshiro Sagata, is extraordinary. Again, it comes back to this thing. You can say on one hand, wow, he hit the ground running. The guy was already running about 500 meters back. He'd been training. He'd been doing everything up to this point. And he actually says in his memoir that he hadn't fully realized what a director's role is. Even though he'd been assistant director, he was still an assistant director on someone else's work. When he became director, he suddenly realized, wow, I'm in charge of all of this now. And I think Sanshiro Sagata is so good a debut because he knew that he could control everything. And the things that sometimes I think a first-time director who's never directed or been an assistant director before, those things that they're grappling with, he knew about. He knew how to deal with those. He was actually dealing with the minutiae. And I think that's what's really interesting with his. I'd say to people, I think because his period films are the best-known films, get to the modern stuff.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, Stray Dog, cop loses his gun.
I mean, it was funny. I did watch that in prep for this, and I was like, this is just a great procedural. Yeah. I don't even need to worry about is it Japanese, is it this, is it that, is it Kurosawa? It's like, this is just a great film to watch. And, you know, it's amazing what you were talking about in terms of seeing them here. And I guess, you know, in the contemporary world, we're always negotiating between streaming and do we go see something at the cinema, and you know, we're always making those decisions for various reasons. But I wondered, like, with a repertory season like this, with a great old master, and I know you've already sort of said, you know, it is great to see them at the cinema. But when I was watching Seven Samurai here at the BFI One, and I was just like, oh my God, I'm being represented with cinema again after lockdown, and you know, we're encouraging people to get back to the cinema. It's almost kind of like coming through that trauma. There's almost a sort of freshness to go back to Kurosawa or someone like that, you know?
I think that's great. I think you're absolutely right. I think that we're all still somehow dealing with that. And I definitely think I am as well. You know, it's funny, you know, for me, I'm caught up in, I'm in the middle of making something, so I'm working on things, and I'm constantly sitting in front of an Avid or a computer, and then, you know, it happens to be January, so it's sort of award season, so you have to watch a bunch of films because you have to vote. Yeah. And so you get caught up in all this other stuff, and then every now and again, it's what you've just said, it's really nice to go to see a movie and just get reminded, oh, that's great. That is actually just brilliant. That's a brilliant artist, and that's a brilliant film, whichever one it may be. And I think it's healthy to do that, because I'm presently very much caught up in, like, I've got to see all the docs, I've got to see all the dramas because I've bloody got to vote, and it's all great, and I'm seeing everything, but not many of them. I don't know how many of them. Maybe the films that we're still watching in 70 years' time.
No, I mean, I had that with when I'd watched Seven Samurai. I mean, I'm not going to name the films, but over the couple of days beforehand, I'd seen a couple of big movies, contemporary movies that were in the conversation. And I was like, I don't want to get off my lawn, I'm an old man, but they really were nowhere near what Seven Samurai was, for sure. Sorry, Ian.
It's this funny thing, isn't it, that a big movie is not necessarily a cinematic film. No. So High and Low, his adaptation of one of the Ed McBain 87th Precinct novels, the first hour of that film, which is essentially about a businessman who is about to buy a company. He's taken a loan out. It's a really big thing. And then he thinks his son has been kidnapped. In actual fact, it's his driver's son has been kidnapped. And there's this moral quandary over, does he pay and it's a typical Kurosawa. It's brilliant. But most of that first hour unfolds in one room. Then it goes out. But it's incredibly cinematic. And actually, I'm just going to say this is one of the reasons why I think Jason Wood at the BFI was inspired in asking you to curate this, Asif, because you've obviously we're doing an event tonight at the BFI, and we're going to see a clip from The Warrior, and you can see the links with Kurosawa there. But you're someone who's taken home video footage for documentaries like Amy and made it cinematic. And now the new film that you've got opening in February here, Creature, you take a choreographer like Akram Khan, whose work I have seen on stage is the most cinematic work. And now you've transferred that into cinema. And this is something that I always think, and hearing you speak before, that it always feels part of your sort of fabric. It's not, I'm going to make a film. It's, I'm going to make cinema.
Thank you. I hope so. I mean, that's the intention, definitely. I am that generation of these were the films that inspired me. But also, it's interesting. I want to make something visual. I want to make it cinematic. I want it to play on a big screen. And also, I want to be able to shift between genre. And that's one of the things that we're talking about with Kurosawa, is that he did all of these different genres. We may know him mostly for one, but there's all these other things there which need to be seen. And they're the directors, I think, that I respect the most, are the ones that can try everything, do everything, and you can see their fingerprint. You can see that's their style. That you can see that's their style. And for me, that in my own way, I kind of, I get bored of doing this, repeating myself. So I want to go off and do something else, and I want to experiment and come out of my comfort zone. But also, you're dealing with humanity. You're dealing with feelings and emotions and characters and drama, and how to make it as visual and as cinematic as possible. And how can we learn something about us or the world or what we mean or why are we here? All of that is the theme that hopefully when you make films, that's what I'm interested in anyway.
Yeah. I mean, just to sort of as a closing point, I think that the two things, or the three things that come up in terms of a Venn diagram of why Kurosawa is so influential or so recognized in the West or so used by Western filmmakers, let's say, is the epic scale of the cinema. That's for one thing. And then there's the universalist themes that we can all kind of gravitate towards. We all understand morality or truth or redemption, which are some of his themes, for example. But then he does place all of that in individualized stories, which is a sort of, very Western underpinning to Western cinema, I think. And you could talk about that in terms of the anti-hero and, some of Mifune's characters and stuff like that. But also in Ikiru, and that sense of, we can it allows us to project as audiences onto that character and think, yeah, this guy is faced with death and now he's got regrets with his life. So you can see why it translates so well to a Western sensibility.
Definitely. And it, again, is something that Asif has spoken about. There's always humor there. I mean, even in the bleakest of situations. His use of the screen wipe, that obviously you ask anyone who's the most famous director with screen wipe, and most people would say, well, George Lucas with Star Wars films. It's like, yeah, no, he got it from someone else. It's a way of creating constant motion until you get to Akira. When you have the women who are trying to get the money from the various departments in government to be able to build this playground, the screen wipe is used in a humorous way to show them going from department to department.
I think that sequence should be studied by people.
It's brilliant.
It's just an opening, isn't it? It's a setup, and it's just genius.
I think that's what's essential, and also the fact that he wasn't ashamed to say, I make films to entertain people.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't believe how much Seven Samurai is a comedy. Yeah. It's just laughs throughout, and you're like, this is amazing because it's set up so brilliantly. It's so simple. It's the 3-act structure. And, as well, you look at it, it's a comedy. It's a romantic comedy because there's that romance. And then there's a sort of mentoring relationship between the master swordsman and the younger samurai. And then at the end of the day as well, it's the blueprint for every blockbuster you've ever seen where, they're all coming to protect this one thing, which is the village in this case. And then there's the final siege and the big battle at the end. It's just like, like I say, it's a blueprint for everything we see.
And maybe that's what's interesting is we all take information, books, literature, paintings, art, culture, and reinterpret it in some way. And an artist or filmmaker in his case, the idea that he's taking literature from the West or from Russia, from the US, and then making it Japanese and then giving it back to the world, and the world then take it and make it very American, and then Americans and it becomes Italian, and then from Italian it becomes Indian or whatever it might be. I think that's great. You know, that's what's really interesting. We all have our own stories, but we also have the same stories. And I think that's what's really interesting about Kurosawa, is that they may seem Japanese, but you can totally relate to them. And often because they're based on Western literature or Shakespeare or whatever it might be. But also, you know, we all have the same experiences.
Exactly. And I mean, people always talk about that West and influence over Kurosawa. And I'm just saying this because I don't think we should have a pecking order between Kurosawa and Ozu and Mizoguchi. It shouldn't be there. But everyone talks about the great Ozu film of Tokyo Story. I think it's now number 3 or 4. No, number 4 in the Sight and Sound poll. Well, as Ozu was quite open in saying, Tokyo Story is a remake of Leo McCarey's 1937 film, Make Way for Tomorrow. It's this thing crosses back and forth. The whole point is that an artist, a filmmaker, has found something universal in something very specific to a culture, but that speaks to many other cultures, which is why there's this crossover. And it's not a bad thing. It's not a watering down. It's not a selling out. It's nothing like that. There's a commonality between people, no matter where they come from. And I think that's the thing to emphasize and to really champion. And I think Kurosawa has that in his films, that universal element, and that's why I think we're having the most extraordinary sellout performances.
Yeah. You know, I've seen just like Rashomon on the board is just sold out all the time, and the Seven Samurai is coming to IMAX, and I know that and Ran is as well.
We'll get a ticket.
Yeah.
We'll get a ticket for that.
We've already got that sorted out.
I just had someone come on the way here. Someone said, "Oh, I tried to get tickets sold out." I'm like, "Oh, bloody hell! I haven't even asked for one yet."
We can blackmail someone.
You've got some privileges
I want to stand
there,
in the back. Yeah,
but I mean, and then you've got.
Isn't that exciting to see
Kurosawa
on IMAX? Isn't that
yeah.
great? You know, when you think about this idea of it, what cinema was when he directed it, and now you get the chance to see these films on the bigger screens that you can get, and they're sold out. Yeah, that's good.
And likewise, you know, his 1975 film Dersu Uzala, the one film he made outside of Japan, not in Japanese, is screening in a pristine 70mm print. This is the one film of all his films you can't get on DVD, is not available to stream in this country, and I think that's brilliant.
Why not?
Yeah. It's rights. I think the home entertainment rights are Mosfilm, and at the moment things are a little tricky.
A bit dodgy there.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean, it is one of the tricky things, you know, the state of the world of films that we may have seen when we were younger that were on TV. So many of them are hard to find. So many of them are hard to see. Some of them are lost. You know, that is also the nature of what's happening, is that people weren't keeping an eye on them or protecting them, you know, and they get lost. And so when you get a chance to see these films, you should go and see them.
And I can imagine, actually, Kurosawa, if he were alive today, he would be sat alongside Scorsese in the World Cinema Fund, championing the film, because he was a cinephile as well as a great filmmaker. You know, he loved watching other people's films, which is why I think he built up so many relationships with not just American directors, British directors, European directors in his lifetime. It wasn't just one-way respect. He really, really loved watching other people's films.
When was he last here?
Not
he must have
sure.
been
Well, he died in the late 90s, and he wasn't travelling, I think, after Ran in 85.
We should look on the.
There is some good.
Did he win the Sutherland Award? I wonder if it was because he
did
for Rashomon.
Yeah, I think he won it for Rashomon, and he's definitely been over here.
There is some good stuff, interview stuff translated now with subtitles on YouTube, so you can really hear some of his.
You know, we are sitting
interviews.
in a historic building where all of these filmmakers would have been here at the National Film Theatre and presented their work, and the audiences would have seen something incredible from around the world for the first time, and they would have come backstage. And I think that it's nice to be talking about him and those films here. Yeah. You know, where it was all happening in the 50s, 60s, 70s. They all came here.
Yeah, for sure. Well, with the magic of podcasting, this will have gone out and you'll have already done your intro, which is happening tonight. I hope that's warmed you up a little bit for that.
How'd it go?
It's so great. It's amazing, like the time travel element of this sometimes. But yeah, I just want to say congratulations and thank you for bringing the season to life. And it's just been great delving in. And Ian, Asif, thanks for coming on the podcast. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks very much then to Asif and to Ian for their time in talking to me and discussing all things Akira Kurosawa. And thanks very much to Sarah at the BFI for setting that up. I really appreciate it. Yeah, Neil, was there anything you wanted to just add very quickly before we dive into a couple of films ourselves?
Yeah, just a really great conversation. Good work. Really enjoyed it. Yeah, lots to think about in terms of their approach to the season, which I think was really astute. I think they covered a lot of maybe some of the questions that you might have about putting on a season like this in 2023. And I think they're kind of very aware of a lot of the questions that might arise. And I think they've really kind of thought about that in their curation in really interesting ways, which is great. And yeah, it's a fantastic kind of thematically put together season. One thing I did want to sort of mention that sort of came out of watching a couple of the titles was how, yeah, this kind of continuing question around Kurosawa and sort of what might be broadly termed Western cinema, and whether there's a kind of rip-off here or an homage there, or like what's really going on. And I think Asif sort of talked really, really sort of eloquently about how the influence flows around the globe over time, and filmmakers are kind of responding to each other in really interesting ways. And the way I'd sort of thought about that before I heard the interview, but certainly watching the films, was watching Stray Dog and feeling how close it is to Bicycle Thieves from the year earlier. It takes this really symbolic cinematic object and puts the person who owns that object in a kind of a moral panic about retrieving it. And it's amazing that they're kind of years apart. I doubt I don't know whether Kurosawa saw it, but certainly, that kind of post-war feeling of, rebuilding and stability and certainty that people were kind of yearning for is kind of all over both of those films in really interesting ways. And they're only a year apart, but they're very, very similar, which I think happens a lot where, people sort of respond, things spring up all over the globe at the same time, which I think is really interesting. And the other one which is a film you're going to talk about in a second, which hopefully be a nice segue in, is I Live in Fear, and how, thinking that Sidney Lumet was a huge Kurosawa fan, a really, really big Kurosawa fan, like one of his favourite filmmakers, and how that's a couple of years before 12 Angry Men, but the whole opening sequence feels really similar. There's this really congested space. There's a lot of people vying for this kind of, dominance in this space, and they just feel like there is a connection there, and whether it's overt, whether it's explicit, I find it really fascinating that you've got this filmmaker on the other side of the world responding very directly to kind of political issues of the day, and yet formally it's very close to what a filmmaker does a couple of years later in America with a different subject, but they formally they're approaching it really. So I just, I like considering it much more as a kind of dialogue between filmmakers who are using cinema as the language that they're sharing rather than anything else. So that was the only thing that sort of came out of that, was maybe thinking about it as a dialogue rather than as a straight kind of taking from a source.
Yeah, no, I think that's really clear. And I think also what clicks into that, and this does segue into the first film that I'm going to talk about in a little bit of detail, which is I Live in Fear, as you mentioned there. And interestingly, I kind of, now you mention it, the Lumet 12 Angry Men is a really, it's a great shout, that. But I was kind of, the first thing I was sort of looking at was where it sits in his filmography. So you've got 49, you've got Stray Dog, then Scandal, Rashomon, The Idiot, 51, Ikiru in 52, Seven Samurai 54, then I Live in Fear 55, and then Throne of Blood afterwards. So you've got like this film wedged in what is, probably if you're gonna say that there's a run that is, top Kurosawa, it's that period late 40s into the early 50s. I know he does great stuff later on, and it's a career of sort of, I mean, nobody ever goes straight up or straight back down. I mean, some filmmakers maybe have got the bell curve of, they hit a peak and then they go downhill. But like Kurosawa seems to be just making great films, and then something that's a bit more personal, or something that's a bit offbeat, something maybe that doesn't quite work. But it's interesting how this wasn't a big success when it first came out, I Live in Fear. And maybe that's because on the back of, it comes on the back of Seven Samurai, which is such a huge epic. And this almost does go back both to maybe Kurosawa's concerns with Japan in the sort of modernist sense, or the post-war, what is Japan after the Second World War, concerns or anxieties that the director might have, and also it's much and maybe in a similar vein to Ikiru, but it's much more socially kind of contextualized than Ikiru is, and yeah, I mean, but maybe the other two films that perhaps sit alongside it thematically, and in that sense, so One Wonderful Sunday and Stray Dog. Perhaps, I mean, this is much less of a genre movie than Stray Dog is, that's for sure. I mean, it's a really kind of mournful film. It's got a lot of pathos in it, and it'd be interesting to see how much to think about how much the director is depicting a society or making a comment on a society emerging from the terrors, or living through the terrors of the potential for nuclear holocaust, and whether how much that is a part of him as well is an interesting thing, because one of the things about this film is the film doesn't really answer any of its own questions, I found, and these are some of the reasons why I think it didn't really do so well, at the box office. Perhaps it's not got the corners or the closure or the wrestling through of ideas to a specific point in the way that the other films that he's done. It's another Mifune collaboration, and yeah, we'll talk about that his performance. But he plays an old man basically with sort of makeup prosthetics on. But it's funny how Mifune still comes through, I think, under all that. He plays an old factory owner who becomes obsessively paranoid about nuclear war, to the extent at which he decides he wants to sell up and move to Brazil with his extended family, because he becomes so paranoid about the potential for nuclear war happening. And this includes his servile wife, and I think they're 4 children, and he's got several mistresses. I think he's got 2 mistresses that are still alive and kids with them, and then one mistress who's died and the kid is still there. And so there's an interesting sort of sense of the power of the patriarch and what the patriarch means in post-war Japan. I mean, maybe that this is the period where there are social mores that are changing, where that is sort of becoming more looked down on, that kind of idea that this big patriarch can kind of do what he wants and everybody else in the family looks the other way, and the wife just sort of stoically deals with it all. And another one of his regular collaborators, Takeshi Shimura plays a dentist who's then a sort of part-time legal arbitrator, who ends up at the beginning opening scenes of the film ends up in this courtroom where the family are essentially taking the father to a tribunal to kind of get him accused or diagnosed as being sort of mentally incompetent to administer his own finances, essentially, right? Because none of them want to go to South America. So there's interesting conversations that take place around the morality of what is going on, and that also extends out to the idea of a society living under the potential cloud of annihilation, and the children are sort of living in perennial denial of that. I don't even, denial's not the right word, but living with it, let's say, and I think that's where it becomes interesting, because I think there are parallels with a lot of the stuff that we've dealt with in COVID in the last few years, and the ongoing crisis, ecological, environmental crisis, and that sense of what should our attitude be towards it. So I think there are some interesting parallels there to be found in sort of contemporary contexts. But the Mifune character, the protagonist, then because they rule against him and he can't take his family, he tries to find ways to get around that. Essentially, I won't give it away if you haven't seen it, because it's on the BFI Player, but he resorts to some radical actions to try and force this move out to Brazil, and he eventually just becomes more and more mentally broken down until you get to the point where this paranoia sort of overtakes him. And Mifune is it's a really interesting performance by him. He's very antagonistic and unsympathetic, and it's interesting because whether that borders on cartoonish, you could argue, and whether it's ever really able to get out of the fact, because underneath it's Mifune. Does he really submerge into that as much as maybe another actor possibly could? But I enjoyed his performance. I thought it was great, but it really is unsympathetic compared to almost anything else I've seen him in. But yeah, and it doesn't end. It doesn't end happily. There's a lot of pathos, and like I say, it doesn't really answer any of the questions. It leaves things open, not necessarily in a kind of art house ambiguous way, but more of a kind of who knows what the answers are to this question kind of way. And I did find some correlations with like Alan René's Night and Fog. I know I've seen that mentioned elsewhere, and the score is amazing as well. It's really weird, particularly at the beginning. You have this sort of sci-fi element to it, and that's Fumio Hayasaka, and it was the last film that he made with Kurosawa, and it does that thing which you get in Kurosawa films when it's actually contra rather than complementary to the images. So it gives this sort of weird, eerie type of feel, which I think is in keeping with the sort of paranoia about there could be an apocalypse to come. But yeah, really interesting, worth a look, but not like a typical Kurosawa piece of work, I would say.
No, thanks for that. Yeah, really interesting, some of the stuff you're saying there. That because I thought similar things when I watched it. It's amazing that you brought up COVID, because I was like, oh yeah, this is exactly how we talk about people who say the pandemic's still going on. There's this kind of like shunt them off to the side, and I think that's what's interesting, is that Mifune's character is unsympathetic and antagonistic, but he's also got the film's moral logic bang on. Like that he sees the potential disaster, and I think that's where it's kind of interestingly sort of generational and gendered, because as you sort of said, Shimura's character learns to see it the same. He doesn't have the same response in terms of his actions, but he certainly sympathizes with Mifune's what he thinks and what he sees as a potential catastrophe for him and his family and Japan. Whereas, there is that sense from the younger generation. They feel the same, but they're going to live with it. I think that's a really astute sort of difference between the two. And I think that's where the ambiguity comes from as well. Like it's kind of sharing it's complicated, because people's experiences, people's ages, like that plays a big role in terms of how you come at these things, which are kind of these big seismic things in terms of how long you've lived, or how you saw, particularly I think as well, kind of it is post-war, so there's a generational difference about what that actually means in Japan, and from people who lived through it in a very direct way and people who were younger or kids, and that's really fascinating. I think what I thought about it was it's shorter, most of his films, even in the period of like the contemporary Japanese stuff, kind of push 2 hours plus, whereas this is hour 45, I think, and it's much more direct, that there's less time and less space given over to some of the things he does in other films, where stretching out, spending time with characters. It is kind of didactic in terms of like, this is the issue at hand and we're staying on it, so it does make for a very, very different experience. and it does stand out because of all those things, I think, you know. But I'd not seen it before, so I was really glad to see it as part of the season. And yeah, it's a fascinating piece of work. And Mifune's physicality is like, because I was like, when is this film made? Like, I know he's in makeup, but you know, the fact that it's like the year after Seven Samurai, you're like, his embodiment is kind of extraordinary. Yeah.
How is that possible? Yeah.
Amazing actor.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think the other thing to remember is this was, it's one of those things where you have to remember when this is coming out. This is like 10 years after, you know, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You know, this was a very real thing. And what's funny, I think, is that there's a little bit of a correlation in the way that we, as a country, as a continent, and as a planet, really, have still really not come to terms with what happened at COVID. I think a lot of us are still kind of in denial about it, and maybe that's mirrored in the you know, what the kids and the family are sort of going through, where they have there's a sort of refusal to process that because they're just wanting to kind of get on with things and get on with life, and hopefully things will get back to normal. And funnily enough, he's at the end, coming to the end of his life. And therefore, there's more of an urgency, even though, you know, it's not going to affect him in the same way because, you know, he's lived his life, as it were. So it's an interesting set of moral quandaries, I think, that is set up here out of, you know, a particular time, I think, in the filmmaker's career. And I've read that I think he didn't really deal as directly with post-war Japan in the same way after this movie. So maybe this was his sort of last attempt, maybe unsuccessful in his own mind, about resolving what the future of Japan looks like, you know, because he definitely doesn't resolve it in the film.
No, and narratively, he kind of, the character kind of stops any potential for dialogue by presenting this huge act. You know, the action of taking the family to Brazil is just allows the children to focus on this shift, you know. So they never really talk about his fear, or, you know, it's mentioned. I think that it's mostly mentioned by Shimura in conversation with his own son, you know, like in terms of what we're actually talking about here. Well, we're talking about utter, you know, we're talking about, again, Hiroshima and Nagasaki again, utter devastation, like the, you know,
annihilation.
But the desire to talk about it and work through it is kind of impeded by himself at every turn, which I think is such a fascinating narrative device and gives the film a real energy, which is frustrating, you know, and allows the central conversation to never be had in such an interesting way that feels really resonant to now, you know, and the noise of focusing on, you know, talking about contracts, government contracts. That's the only way we talk about the pandemic. Who got the contracts? Who got the PPE contracts? All that waste of money. It's like, you know, we don't have the conversations about what it really means because there's all these handy things to actually focus on, to divert from the fear of talking about what we know has happened and what we know is still happening. So it's a really, really interesting film.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about the film you've picked.
So I wanted to talk about High and Low from the early 60s. And this was a film that I saw a long time ago and loved. And just something about it was like, this is the one I want to look at. And I think because it was another adaptation. It's an adaptation of Ed McBain, a kind of American pulp author, and just the curiosity of kind of thinking about that as a starting point. And I thought it was interesting when Asif was talking about, and Ian were talking about interpretations rather than adaptations, because I love his adaptations, you know, Ran and Throne of Blood, but they're always interpretations. They're always interesting approaches to material, sort of finding things and drawing them out. I also watched The Bad Sleep Well, which is his loose interpretation of Hamlet, which is a really interesting film with Mifune amazing again. And one of the things I loved about that was the way it used the idea of the ghost. There's a really amazing sequence around ghosts, which is just fantastic. But yeah, just the way he kind of approaches the material, latches onto something, and then kind of draws it out. And in High and Low, it sort of brings together a lot of the stuff I see in other parts of his contemporary Japanese work, sort of all brought together in a really wonderful way. So it opens with this incredible long sequence where Mifune again plays this kind of executive in a shoe company whose son is kidnapped, but not kidnapped because the kidnapper takes the wrong boy, takes the chauffeur's boy as opposed to his boy. And it's this really long sequence in a flat, or in an apartment overlooking Tokyo, and it's so long and so detailed, and Mifune just kind of stalks the whole thing with this kind of incredible presence. But it's about his role at work, and then obviously his role in the family, his ambitions to take over the company. Then there's the kidnapping, and it all kind of plays out in like 30 minutes of in one location that never feels theatrical, because, as again came up in the conversation, like his use of the camera is exquisite, like it never feels stagey. The camera's always doing something interesting. Like but it really sets up all the issues in the film around poverty, which kind of he comes back to again and again, where like making something of yourself and rising up from a position of poverty to a position of wealth, the class implications of that, the relationship he has with the chauffeur, and there's just so many interesting things come out in this kind of really just amazing sequence, which is very much like The Bad Sleep Well, where there's this really long wedding sequence which opens the film, which does something very, very similar. And then the police arrive and it becomes a different film. Like it flows into a different film where they take over the film in terms of the point of view.
Completely different. Yeah.
It becomes this procedural where they're just really working hard to find the kidnapper, and they find the kidnapper, and then find the money and get Mifune his money back because he pays the ransom. And what's amazing is like he's able to juggle all of his interests around sort of class and business and the economy with a real affection for the police and the work they do, which again feels very similar to Stray Dog. Where so much of the time in Stray Dog is spent on Mifune's mentor. Where he's such a good cop and he's such a great character, and I love in High and Low how they just have all this banter. They're just laughing and joking, and there's like a child's being kidnapped, but you really get a sense of like how they cope with how they cope. They create this community of policemen, and they know it's hard work, they know it's horrible work, but it's a really interesting portrayal, I think. And then the kidnapper comes in as a character, and there's time spent with them, and Mifune's character kind of shrinks into the background, kind of defeated by the actions that he basically, it's not a spoiler, but he has to give up the money he was going to use to buy the company and retain control of the company. He uses that money to pay the ransom. And then the police and the chauffeur kind of spend the rest of the film trying to get his money back. And he just becomes this guy who mows the lawn, and the film carries on without him. But he's this presence in it. And what I think makes it such an extraordinary piece of work in terms of how it manages to do that, which is not an easy thing to do, particularly with an actor like Mifune, but certainly a character who's dominated the first 45 minutes of a film, is through the filmmaking. There's two sequences in particular, one on the train where the ransom payoff, which is so tense and so exquisitely put together and so kind of just terrifying in terms of, the way it's shot and the way it's put together. It's just kind of heart in mouth. Like this is a master filmmaker.
It's Mission Impossible style, that sequence. It's incredible.
Yeah, great shout. That's exactly what it feels like. All the points of view, all the different characters, and then just the fact that you feel the real jeopardy both on the train and then as it's whizzing past, and you trying to glimpse the people who are waiting for the bag and have got the kid, because there's that thing where they say like, he'll show you the child, and you see the child in the sort of the long shot as the train whizzes past. It's an incredible shot, and technically it's just amazing. and then that kind of just puts you in mind of like, this is extraordinary. But then the sequence, I think, which is just unbelievable, is a sequence later on where the police are staking out the kidnapper in a nightclub, and they're kind of following him round as they're trying to work out how he's going to get some drugs to kill some of the people he did the kidnapping with. And it's this really long procedural sequence, but it's so well cut. And then halfway through it, the kidnapper sort of goes into a nightclub and the police follow him. And just the music, the way a lot of the narrative unfolds in terms of that. So it's just absolutely incredible. And it's like his fidelity to kind of telling the story in such a beautiful cinema is it never drops, you know. So you can have all these narrative twists and these changes of point of view, and it's just, you're so gripped by the storytelling that you're absolutely swept up along with it. And then at the end, it's resolved, and you're just like, wow, I don't know how he did that, you know. Like, and it's over 2 hours again, but it's just like, you know, it's masterful, you know. And all of that from essentially a very simple pulp kidnap movie. And it's like, wow, that's seeing that in that story and being able to spin that way of telling it is kind of amazing. And the last note, which kind of is in High and Low, and also Live in Fear, and also Stray Dog, is it's sweltering in the summer in Japan, clearly, because all of these characters are doing all of this stuff. They're living through these immense crises, and the sweat and the perspiration is just dripping off them. They're constantly mopping themselves. They're constantly trying to stay cool. Like, I just like, wow, seeing the films in that kind of, you know, collection was like, wow, it's really interesting the strain he puts his characters under physically in this kind of environment, alongside the high stakes of the story. I just never really noticed it, and it was really nice to see it in that way. And just, yeah, like, everyone's sweating all the time. It must be, maybe not want to go to Japan in the summer. Made me think I'll go in the autumn if I ever go.
Yeah, it's funny because a lot of people, you know, have commented on Kurosawa's obsession with rain, but his films are as sweaty as they are rainy. So he's clearly got a kind of interest in in the way that human beings sort of exist in this, you know, in a kind of an arena of moisture, let's say. And I don't know, maybe it's a way of kind of adding texture to things. Do you know what I mean? To the experience of watching a film. So it's not just flat. It's kind of like it gives your brain, the brain of the audience, a kind of sense of here is a, you know, the characters are in an environment and they're feeling things haptically, and the rain is happening from it, you know, on top of them. And you know, obviously a lot of it fits in symbolically as well. But yeah, just, I mean, again, just quickly sort of reacting to that. That's the first thing I could think of. But yeah, it's funny because it does link back to what you said earlier on about the Western influence, or the influence of his films on the West and vice versa. And you know, I think it's such a great shout to say that, you know, they're in dialogue, and I think this is where you get the perhaps the trite observation or the trite critique that, you know, well, he's not quite up there with Ozu or Mizoguchi, and maybe not quintessentially Japanese in that sense, but he's quintessentially a filmmaker, and I think that he's not riven by that sense of a auteurist style that has to manifest itself from film to film so people can kind of collectivize a personal vision across all of his work. He's more interested in the sort of experimentation of mechanics and possibilities. And yeah, why not have half an hour of a sort of board meeting that sets up all the kind of political dynamics and economic dynamics at the start, and which gives you then the context to realize why the decision to pay this ransom or not has more consequences beyond simply the moral one. You know what I mean? Because it would have been really simple and easy, again, maybe in an American movie, to say, well, of course, the protagonist will pay for the, you know, it will either pay for the ransom of the chauffeur's boy, because he's morally right, or he won't because he's an arsehole. You know what I mean? That would be the black and white way to do it. Whereas placing it in that sort of wider context, it kind of gives that character an interesting depth. And again, sort of going forward, with the set pieces and the camera movements, and again, it links a little bit to what I said at the beginning about Vertigo, and just what sort of watching a Hitchcock movie, you can see the directorial intervention into where the camera should go and why it's been placed there, so it can then move there, and the actor's moving there, and there's a lot of that. And sometimes that does look a bit staged now from 2022, but Kurosawa's films never seem to in the same way. So it's interesting, I think, where you listen to Scorsese and you listen to Spielberg, and it's like we figured out what cinema was through watching Kurosawa, and it's clear it's not just technique. It's kind of like, because he makes great films to watch, and this is a great film, and it's not. It does have the elements of genre, but it's just so much more than that, And we watch a lot of genre films still today. I mean, we're submerged in them, but there's very few. Maybe it's because filmmakers are not allowed the latitude that Kurosawa by this point had to take a genre kind of element and really push it in so many interesting ways.
Yeah, I think that that is a point I did want to sort of pick up on in terms of that idea of genre and what he does with it. I think within Japan he's making samurai movies, which obviously feel and are very Japanese, but a lot of the contemporary works, particularly the films that I was rewatching, they are genre movies, but they're also they are very much about Japan at that time, and I think it's built into the theme a lot, particularly kind of the generational tensions between a kind of an older generation and the younger generation comes up quite a lot. But also it builds it into plot, like in Stray Dog, like the plot hinges on ration cards. It's set in the ruins literally 4 years after the devastation of World War II, where you see what that world looks like, and this character is going through it. The politics of Japan are all in the locations, they're all in these characters, and you get the sense from Mifune's character that he needs this. He's so invested in this particular way of life because he doesn't want to slip back down into poverty. They are very, very astute in terms of how they are commenting on the world around them in genre movies. And I think he's probably the prime example of someone who it has been written off as a genre filmmaker, which is insane because he's doing so many interesting things in those spaces that no one else is doing. I think thinking about Mifune in Stray Dog, like he is the protagonist, but he's also not, because he's racing around trying to find this gun that's been taken, but he doesn't resolve anything really. He's responding all the time. Like the older cop is the one who's doing most of the police work. He's an observer, but he's, because of the presence of Mifune, like it's such an interesting thing to watch this character basically helpless, racing around, chasing his own tail. Like, it subverts genre at every, while also Mifune looks great and he's running around as a cop. Like it's amazing how he does all this stuff at once, and I think what's interesting is never knowing what was he really going for. I think that's what, I've never read enough about him, but he's doing so much, but how did he see himself? Like what was his purpose of, because there's so much instinctive smartness in so much of this stuff that I think if you sat down and tried to do it methodically and tried to subvert it in all the ways he subverts it all the time, I don't think you could do it. I think he obviously had something that was driving him, and these were his instincts, and they were just so interesting that we're still poring over them now and trying to work out what the hell he was going after.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just a pleasure to revisit, a lot of these films and obviously, I mean, we talked a little bit about going to the cinema. Maybe we'll talk a bit more about that in the bonus, the sort of the pleasure and the privilege of that, depending on where you live. So I'm very lucky that I get to see some of this stuff live. I mean, live at the auditorium, as it were. But as the guy said in the interview, it is great that this is the BFI player is there, and you can watch. You can participate in this season, let's say. And there's there is lots of stuff online. If you're listening to us, then go and watch these films, and I'm sure you'll get a lot out of it. You'll get a lot out of them, and I think part of our reason for being as a podcast is just, from the beginning it was always about bringing stuff to light that we like to watch, and it's not as if we're bringing light to Kurosawa. He doesn't need that. He doesn't need any introductions in terms of a sort of cinephile world. But yeah, to have the season there to be able to participate in and have this conversation has been great, and just a great excuse really to come back to Kurosawa.
Yeah, and I think that what is really important, I think we maybe even mentioned this the first time we did the Kurosawa episode, is like, it's easy to take these filmmakers for granted and assume that everyone knows their work, everyone knows a lot of their work, or everyone understands why they might be significant in terms of cinematic history. And I don't think that's the case. I think that part of the role of curation, repertory theatre, places like the BFI, is to remind people, actually, this stuff you have to revisit it, because just revisiting these few films, I was like, things I didn't know, things I'd forgotten, things I hadn't seen because of the way I'd seen stuff in the past. Like, we don't know a lot about Kurosawa, even though we might have seen all of his films. Like, spending time revisiting this stuff is really, I think it's really important in terms of not taking it for granted and not assuming that, oh yeah, everyone knows Kurosawa's great. Well, do they? And if they don't, why don't they? Have they just not seen it? Have they not engaged with it? Like, is it still worth looking back at this stuff? And I think that's important. That's important cultural work, I think, so that it's not just assumed that everyone knows that Seven Samurai is a masterpiece.
Yeah, no, for sure. So, yeah, great. We hope you've enjoyed that. We're going to go over to the bonus now and have a chat about various other films and maybe about film going more broadly, for sure. Neil, do you want to close us out?
Sure. So yeah, a pleasure to spend time talking about this. Thanks to Asif and Ian for the time for talking to Dario for the main interview. Thanks to Sarah at the BFI for setting it up and for giving us access to the BFI Player so we could watch this stuff. I will be retaining my subscription. The free press pass has done its job because I'm going to keep it. It's really enjoying spending time on the BFI Player. And yeah, thanks to you all for listening. Join us on the bonus. But if not, we will catch you next time. This has been the Cinematologist Podcast. Thanks for listening.